Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Written in fireworks. The salt-laced wind of Bluewater Beach, Massachusetts, carried the familiar symphony of a 4th of July sunset. Laughter from nearby families, the sizzle of a distant grill, the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. It was a soundscape Lily Morgan knew by heart. At 58, she had seen this scene unfold more times than she could count. She sat on a faded patchwork blanket, a relic of family vacations past, and watched her two grown children, Maya and Ben, bicker good-naturedly while setting up camp chairs. They were good kids, with kind hearts and lives of their own, yet a strange and persistent sense of detachment settled over her, as fine and cool as the evening mist rolling in off the Atlantic. This year felt different. The nostalgia that usually warmed her was tinged with a peculiar melancholy. 40 years, she did the math again, a silent, reflexive habit that returned every summer. 40 years since the Bicentennial. The setting sun cast a molten gold path across the water, and as the sky deepened to bruised purple, the present dissolved. The scent of coconut sunscreen and cheap beer was replaced by the sweeter aroma of Coppertone and tab soda. The tinny echo of a portable radio playing disco morphed into the full-throated celebration of 1976. July 4th, 1976. Lily, 18 and shimmering with the nervous energy of youth, slipped away from her parents' boisterous beach party. Their friends, loud and flushed with patriotic fervour, were debating politics, while she felt a universe of feeling coiling in her chest, too vast and undefined for their small talk. She needed air. She needed a moment that was her own. Ducking under the boardwalk felt like entering a secret world. The roar of the crowd above became a muffled, rhythmic thunder. The setting sun striped the sand between the thick wooden planks, casting the space in a cathedral-like twilight. She wasn't alone. A boy was leaning against a pylon, his back to her, silhouetted against the glittering sea. He was tall, with a sweep of dark hair that fell across his brow. He turned at the crunch of her bare feet in the sand, and his eyes, a startling shade of green even in the dim light, widened slightly. "Sorry," she'd mumbled. "I thought I was the only one hiding." A slow smile spread across his face, instantly crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Best hiding spot on the beach. You can hear the world without having to be in it." His name was Daniel. He was from a town a few hours away visiting his grandparents. She was Lily, a local about to start college in the fall. They talked for what felt like minutes and hours. They didn't speak of the things teenagers usually did, school, sports, gossip. Instead, they spoke of the things that truly mattered. He dreamt of building things, structures that would last, while she dreamt of filling blank pages with stories that would move people. They talked about the future as if it were a tangible place they could map out together, there in the cool, quiet dark. The first firework was an unexpected cannon shot that made them both jump. Through the gaps in the boardwalk they watched the sky ignite. Bursts of sapphire, ruby and glittering gold bloomed and wept across the velvet darkness. It was the grand finale of the Bicentennial display, a spectacle of unprecedented scale. As a particularly magnificent explosion of white glitter cascaded downwards, bathing their hideaway in a strobe of otherworldly light, he turned to her, the world went silent. She saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. He leaned in, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, and kissed her. It wasn't a fumbling teenage kiss. It was a kiss of startling certainty, a moment of profound recognition. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the sky was raining down its final embers. "It's like the sky itself is celebrating what we'd found," he'd whispered. his voice thick with an emotion that mirrored her own. "Meet me tomorrow," he said, his hand still warm on her skin. "Noon, by the lighthouse. Don't be late. I'll be there," she promised, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but he never came. She had waited for 2 hours, her hope slowly souring into a hollow ache of confusion and rejection that would subtly colour her life for years to come. She never even learned his last name. "Mom, you okay?" Maya's voice sliced through the decades, pulling Lily back to the present. Lily blinked, the ghost of that kiss still tingling on her lips. The ache was no longer sharp, but a dull, familiar throb. "Fine, honey. Just thinking." She forced a smile. "You looked 1,000,000 miles away," Ben added, handing her a bottle of water. 1,000,000 miles. 40 years. "How did that happen?" she whispered to herself, the words stolen by the wind. She got to her feet, brushing sand from her capri. The sun had completely vanished now, leaving behind a sky of deepening twilight. "I'm just going for a little walk," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "Before the show starts." She didn't wait for their questions. Her feet, acting on an instinct older than her own children, turned her not towards the crowded pier, but down the beach towards the solitary stoic silhouette of the old Blue Water lighthouse, its beacon just beginning to sweep across the darkening water. The path to the lighthouse was quieter, a gentle ascent away from the boisterous energy of the main beach. A string of festive lights had been wound through the gnarled branches of the scrub pines, casting a soft, intermittent glow. From a beachfront restaurant below, the soulful, melancholic notes of a saxophone drifted on the breeze, a lonely counterpoint to the distant pop and fizzle of amateur fireworks. Lily walked slowly, her sandals scuffing against the sandy asphalt, her heart beating with a strange, anticipatory rhythm she couldn't explain. It was foolish, this pilgrimage, a sentimental journey into a memory. Halfway up the path, a lone figure sat on a memorial bench overlooking the water. Even in the deepening dusk, the profile was unmistakable. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the head as he gazed out at the horizon. It was a silhouette etched into the most private corners of her memory. His hair was silver now, catching the faint light from the distant pier, but the shape of him, the quiet intensity of his stillness, was the same. Lily stopped dead, her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful snag. It couldn't be. After all this time, it was impossible. It was a trick of the light, a projection of her own wistful imagination. And yet she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, she knew. How many times had she imagined this moment? In her 20s with defiant anger, in her 30s with a sad romantic curiosity, in her 40s with the weary resignation that some doors were meant to stay closed. And now, at 58, it was happening on a random Tuesday in July, and all she could feel was a profound, paralysing shock. He must have sensed her presence. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping from the ocean toward her. His eyes, still that same startling green, met hers across the 20 feet of charged space. There was a flicker of casual curiosity, the kind you give a stranger passing by, and then it happened. A jolt, a visible physical reaction. His posture straightened, his brows furrowed in disbelief, a slow, dawning comprehension washing over his features like the incoming tide. The saxophone music faded. The chatter of the distant crowd disappeared. The world narrowed to this single, impossible point of connection. She was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper carried on the salty air. "You never came back." It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth that had shaped the landscape of her heart for 4 decades. He stood up, his movements stiff as if his body had forgotten how to work. He took a hesitant step toward her. "Lily." The name was a question, a breath of disbelief. She nodded, unable to form another word. I His voice broke thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. He cleared his throat and tried again. My father had a heart attack that night, right after the fireworks. We got the call from my grandmother. We left for the hospital in Boston before dawn. He raked a hand through his silver hair, a gesture of pure, unadulterated distress. I never got your last name. I didn't know your address. I came back the next summer, and the one after that. I asked around. No one knew who I was talking about. For years I tried to find you. The story, so simple and so devastating, landed in the space between them, extinguishing the faint, lingering embers of her teenage resentment and replacing them with a hollow echo of shared loss. All those years she'd thought of it as her abandonment. It had never occurred to her that it was his tragedy. The awkwardness of the moment was immense, a chasm of 40 years of unlived life. They filled it with the clumsy, necessary architecture of small talk. He was Daniel Reynolds, an architect, just as he'd dreamed. He'd married a woman named Beth, a wonderful woman. They had 2 daughters. He'd lost Beth to cancer 5 years ago. She was Lily Morgan. She hadn't become a famous novelist, but a high school English teacher who, she hoped, had at least inspired a few kids to love stories. She'd married Tom, raised Maya and Ben. She and Tom had divorced 3 years prior. They were strangers, their lives full of people and places the other had never known. And yet, beneath the polite exchange of biographical data, the original current still hummed, a low, powerful frequency that had never truly gone silent. As true darkness finally fell, they began to walk instinctively, side by side but not to touching, back down the path toward the gathering crowd. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of the lives they might have lived. Suddenly, the first official firework of the night screamed into the sky. A percussive thump shook the air, followed by a brilliant explosion of chrysanthemum white light directly overhead. They both stopped and looked up, their faces illuminated in the same fleeting, spectacular glow. For a dizzying second, time collapsed. They were 18 again, standing on the precipice of everything, the sky exploding just for them. The light faded, plunging them back into darkness, but the image remained, seared into Lily's mind. His face older, lined with life and loss, but his eyes holding the very same wonder she remembered from a lifetime ago. The following afternoon the sky wept. A steady, gentle rain pattered against the large picture windows of the Salty Dog Cafe, blurring the view of the beach into a watercolour of muted greys and blues. Inside, the cafe was a warm, intimate cocoon smelling of coffee beans and cinnamon. The rain provided a perfect excuse, a neutral ground where the charged atmosphere of the previous night could settle. Lily and Daniel sat across from each other in a worn wooden booth, ceramic mugs warming their hands. For 2 hours they unspooled the tapestry of their lives, weaving the threads of 4 decades into a shared story. He pulled out his phone to show her photos of his daughters, Amelia and Chloe, one a lawyer in New York, the other a landscape designer in Oregon. He spoke of his late wife Beth with a quiet, reverent affection that brought a lump to Lily's throat. He described the buildings he had designed, his pride evident in the way his hands moved, sketching invisible lines in the air. Lily in turn shared snapshots of Maya and Ben, from gap-toothed school pictures to their recent college graduations. She spoke of her teaching career, the challenges and the triumphs, the faces of students she would never forget. And then, hesitantly, she spoke of her divorce. It wasn't one big thing, she confessed, staring into her coffee. It was a slow erosion. Tom, he found someone else, but if I'm being honest, he'd been gone a long time before that, and I had been too. She looked up, her gaze direct and vulnerable. Sometimes I feel like I'm just playing a part, mother, teacher, ex-wife. I feel like I lost track of just being Lily somewhere along the way. Daniel nodded, a deep knowing sadness in his eyes. After Beth died, The silence in the house was deafening. I realised I'd built my entire identity around being her husband, the girl's father. I was a partner in a firm, a pillar of the community, but when the pillar you're leaning against is gone... He trailed off, his gaze distant. I'm still trying to find the pieces of myself in the rubble. In that shared confession, the 40 years between them seemed to shrink, the chasm of their separate lives bridged by a common, deeply human experience of loss and reinvention. They weren't just the ghosts of two teenagers under a boardwalk anymore. They were two adults, weathered by life, recognizing their own scars in the other. As she spoke, she reached for the sugar dispenser at the same moment he did. The backs of their hands brushed against each other, a fleeting, incidental contact. But it was not incidental. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up Lily's arm, a physical manifestation of the current that had been humming beneath the surface since she'd first seen him on the path. They both pulled back instantly, a blush rising on Lily's cheeks. The air crackled with the sudden, undeniable awareness of now, not just then. Daniel flustered, cleared his throat and fumbled for his wallet. "I wanted to show you something," he said, his voice a little strained. He carefully extracted a worn, folded piece of paper from a hidden flap. He unfolded it with a reverence that made Lily's heart ache. It was a ticket stub, faded and soft with age. Across the top she could just make out the words, US Bicentennial Grand Finale, Fireworks Display, July 4th, 1976. "I've kept this for 40 years, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fragile paper. It was my one perfect night. A reminder that a night like that was even possible. Lily stared at the ticket, this tangible proof of her own memory, and felt the last wall around her heart begin to crumble. Before she could find the words to respond, her phone buzzed on the table, a jarring intrusion of the present. It was Maya. "Mom, where are you? We're all getting together for dinner at the Clam Shack. Ben's treat." Reality rushed back in. She had a family, a life, obligations that existed outside this rainy cafe cocoon. "I have to go," she said, the reluctance heavy in her voice. "Of course," Daniel said, quickly tucking the ticket away. They stood, the awkwardness returning. "I'm here until Sunday," he offered. "Maybe we could see the final fireworks display tomorrow night. Together." "I'd like that," Lily said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. She turned and walked to the door, pulling up the hood of her raincoat. As she stepped out into the misty rain, something made her glance back. Through the rain-streaked window, Daniel was still standing by the booth, watching her go, and on his face was an expression of such quiet, profound longing that it mirrored the one she knew must be on her own. The air on Saturday evening was thick and unstable. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving behind a bruised, dramatic sky. Heavy dark clouds muscled their way in from the west, and a restless wind whipped across the beach, flapping flags and threatening to steal hats. Despite the ominous weather, the boardwalk was thronged with people, a holiday weekend crowd determined to squeeze the last drop of summer from the night. Lily arrived with Maya and Ben in tow, a nervous knot tightening in her stomach. They were more than sceptical, they were fiercely protective, their questions peppered with a loving concern that felt like a gentle interrogation. "A guy you met for 2 hours 40 years ago? Mum, are you sure about this?" Ben had asked. Daniel was waiting for them near the entrance to the pier, his silver hair ruffled by the wind. He wasn't alone. 2 young women stood with him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and a similar guarded protectiveness. They were unmistakably his daughters. The introductions were a masterclass in polite tension. Lily met Amelia and Chloe. Daniel met Maya and Ben. They all shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, their smiles tight, their eyes assessing. The 6 of them stood in a slightly awkward circle, a solar system of 2 families colliding. The silence was broken by Chloe, Daniel's younger daughter, who leaned toward her sister and whispered, just a little too loudly. "Dad barely even mentions Mum anymore, but he's talked about your mother non-stop for 2 days." The comment hung in the air, mortifying and illuminating in equal measure. A flush crept up Daniel's neck. Lily's own children exchanged a look. Seeking to diffuse the tension, Maya suggested they go find a spot to lay their blankets, a subtle act of separation. For a moment, Daniel and Lily were left alone in the churning river of the crowd. The wind whipped a strand of hair across Lily's face. Daniel reached out, his instinct faster than his thought, and gently tucked it behind her ear. His fingers grazed her temple, warm and firm. "I should have kissed you again," he said suddenly, his voice low and intense, cutting through the noise. "Yesterday, at the cafe, when our hands touched, I wanted to." Lily's heart hammered against her ribs. She opened her mouth to respond, to say "I wanted you to," but the words were stolen by a sudden collective gasp from the crowd. A fat, cold drop of rain hit her forehead, then another, and another. The threatened storm broke with a theatrical, almost violent suddenness. The sky opened up and a torrential downpour began, sending people shrieking and laughing as they scrambled for cover. The boardwalk became a chaotic exodus of panicked families gathering blankets and children. The fireworks were, without a doubt, cancelled. In the ensuing mayhem, they were separated. Lily was swept along with the surge of people heading for the parking lot. She called Daniel's name, but her voice was swallowed by the wind and the drumming rain. She lost sight of her own kids. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Acting on a primal, half-conscious instinct, she broke away from the fleeing crowd and ran, ducking under the familiar, cavernous shelter of the boardwalk. It was the same section. She knew it instantly. The rain fell in solid, silvery sheets just beyond the edge of her refuge, the roar on the wooden planks above a deafening drumbeat. Soaked, shivering and utterly alone, a wave of emotional crisis washed over her. The absurdity of it all hit her with the force of the storm. What was she doing? Chasing a memory, a feeling from when she was 18? She was a grown woman, a mother, an ex-wife standing in the rain and chasing a ghost. Was she trying to recapture a moment that was never meant to be more than that? A perfect singular flash in time? "Lily!" His voice cut through the roar. She spun around. Daniel appeared through the curtain of the rain, his shirt plastered to his chest, his hair slicked to his head, looking as drenched and desperate as she felt. He strode toward her, his eyes locking on hers with an intensity that stopped her breath. "I won't lose you again," he said, his voice raw and ragged. "Not in a crowd, not in a storm, not this time." He didn't hesitate. He closed the remaining distance between them, cupped her face in his hands just as he had done a lifetime ago, and kissed her. It was not the tender, exploratory kiss of their youth. This was a kiss of 40 years of waiting, of questions and what-ifs, of loss and longing. It was hungry and desperate and certain all at once. It was the storm and the shelter. It was the collision of their past and the explosive, undeniable reality of their present. The 4 decades of silence between them dissolved in that single, soul-shattering instant. 1 year later, July 4th, the sun, a benevolent orange orb, dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold. The air was warm and still, holding the promise of a perfect summer night. On the same stretch of Bluewater Beach, Lily leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, the familiar patchwork blanket spread beneath them. The scene was the same, yet everything was different. A comfortable distance away, their children mingled. The awkwardness of the previous year had softened into a tentative, evolving warmth. Lily watched as Daniel's older daughter Amelia showed Ben a photo on her phone, both of them laughing at something. Maya was in a deep conversation with Chloe about perennial flowers. It wasn't one big, perfectly blended family, not yet, but it was the start of something new. A constellation formed from the gravitational pull of 2 separate stars. Their year had been a whirlwind of logistics and emotion. It had been weekends spent driving the 3 hours between her home and his. It had been long phone calls late into the night, filling in the vast empty spaces of their 40-year separation. It had been the slow, careful process of introducing their histories, their friends, their favourite coffee mugs, the quiet sorrows they each carried. It was the gradual, beautiful merging of two lives that had run parallel for so long. "We're moving too fast," she teased, her voice a low murmur against his collarbone. "'Cause 41 years to get to this blanket." He chuckled, the sound a warm vibration that resonated through her. "I'm making up for lost time." He shifted, reaching into the canvas tote bag beside him. He pulled out a small velvet-wrapped box. Her heart gave a little flutter, even though they'd talked about it. They were in no rush. They were savouring this, the rediscovery. It wasn't a ring. He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver pendant on a thin chain. It was an abstract shape, a burst of intricate silver lines radiating from a central point. A firework. "For someone who understands that timing isn't always what we plan," he said, his green eyes soft and serious. "Sometimes it's exactly what we need." He carefully unclasped the chain and fastened it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The cool metal settled against her collarbone, a tiny, perfect star. As dusk settled completely, and the first firework of the night streaked into the sky, Daniel gestured with his chin towards a charming, grey-shingled beach house just behind the dunes, its porchlight glowing invitingly. "I was looking at the rental listings," he said casually, though she could hear the undercurrent of excitement in his voice. "That one's available for the winter. I was thinking, what if we didn't have to leave this time? What if we didn't have to drive away on Sunday? What if this became our place?" Lily looked from the house, a beacon of warmth against the darkening sky, to his face, illuminated by a burst of emerald green light from above. In his eyes she saw their future unfolding, not a frantic recapturing of youth, but something richer, deeper. She saw quiet winters walking this very shore, hand in hand. She saw summers filled with the laughter of their children, and maybe one day their grandchildren. She saw them building something new and lasting on the foundation of that one magical long-ago connection. She lifted her hand to touch the pendant at her throat. Perhaps the heart keeps its own calendar, marking not days or years, but moments of perfect connection. Her gaze met his, full of a love that felt both brand new and ancient. "Some fires burn briefly," she said, her voice full of emotion as she watched the explosion reflect in his eyes. "But others, the ones that matter, they just wait for the right moment to light up the sky again." His fingers found hers, lacing through them, a comfortable, solid weight. As the grand finale began, painting the heavens in a riot of brilliant temporary light, they held on tight. Their story, written in fireworks, was a promise of something far more permanent, a love that had waited patiently for the tide to turn and bring it safely home to shore. When the Willow Weeps. The sky wept that evening, a relentless, mournful cry that mirrored the one Eleanor Hart often felt trapped within her own chest. It was late autumn in Mississippi in 1946, and the wind, a bitter harbinger of winter, tore at the eaves of her small weathered farmhouse. Inside, the meagre warmth from the hearth fought a losing battle against the chill, seeping through the old panes. 5-year-old Lily, her usually bright eyes shadowed with a childhood weariness Eleanor knew all too well, clung to her skirts, a silent anchor in a world that felt perpetually adrift. Eleanor was trying to coax the last of the corn from the stubbornly damp earth, her hands raw and aching, when the first heavy drops began. She'd looked up at the bruised sky, a familiar wave of despair washing over her. Every season since Thomas had died, it seemed the farm fought her, and she fought back with a weary stubbornness born of necessity. Now, with the storm closing in, the thought of the unharvested corn was a fresh weight on her shoulders. She guided Lily, her small hand swallowed by Eleanor's calloused one, back towards the house, the mud sucking at their worn boots. Just as the wind began to howl in earnest, a knock sounded, startling them both. It was a tentative sound, yet insistent against the roar of the downpour. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Thomas had always warned her about strangers, about the dangers that lurked beyond the familiar rhythm of their isolated life. But Thomas was gone, and the world was a far less predictable place. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the swirling curtain of rain. A man stood silhouetted against the fading light, water streaming from the brim of his wide-brimmed hat, plastering his clothes to his lean frame. He was tall, but there was a distinct list to his left leg, an awkward weight shift that spoke of injury. "Ma'am," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, a low rumble against the storm. "My car broke down a few miles back. Storm caught me. I just need a dry place for the night. I'll be gone by first light." Eleanor hesitated. Her every instinct, honed by years of hardship and sudden loss, screamed caution. This was Mississippi, 1946. Men like him, drifters, sometimes brought trouble. Her gaze flickered to Lily, who had now peeked out from behind her mother's leg, her big, curious eyes fixed on the stranger. Lily, who trusted too easily, whose innocence was a constant, fragile worry. Every fear of her being screamed caution, yet something in his eyes, a profound weariness, tugged at her. It wasn't a threat she saw there, but an exhaustion that mirrored her own, a deep, bone-tired ache that seemed to emanate from his very core. He looked less like a threat and more like a man who had seen too much of the world's harshness. A veteran, perhaps. She'd seen that look in the eyes of other men returning from overseas, a haunted distance that no amount of peacetime could erase. "Mummy, he looks cold," Lily whispered, her small voice a tender plea. The man, as if sensing Lily's unspoken compassion, offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "I just need a dry place, Ma'am. I'll earn my keep." His gaze, though tired, was steady, unflinching. Eleanor swallowed, the bitter taste of fear and resignation thick in her mouth. She thought of the long, lonely nights, the creaking of the house, the constant struggle. Could she really turn her soul away on a night like this? A flicker of unexpected empathy, perhaps even a foolish hope, stirred within her. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above the wind's wail. She opened the door wider, allowing him to step into the small, warm embrace of her home. The scent of damp earth clung to him, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of the rain. He stepped inside, dripping onto the worn linoleum, and immediately looked around for something to do, his gaze falling on the pile of unchopped firewood by the hearth. "I can help with that, Ma'am," he offered, his voice still low, almost deferential. He moved slowly, a visible stiffness in his left leg, a subtle favouring that confirmed her suspicion of an injury. A soldier, then, returning from a war that had left scars both visible and unseen. Eleanor watched him, a knot of apprehension slowly loosening in her chest, replaced by a cautious curiosity. His name, he offered, was Daniel Cole, just Daniel. He didn't offer a last name, nor did she press for one. The immediate task was simply to survive the storm, to find shelter from its fury. As he bent, wincing slightly, to stack the firewood, the relentless rain outside, a steady drum against the window panes, became a strange, comforting backdrop to their unexpected shared space. The crackling fire, once just a source of heat, now seemed to hum with a new, tentative life. And in the quiet warmth of her small farmhouse, With Lily's soft breathing beside her, Eleanor felt a fragile sense of peace, a momentary reprieve from the relentless cold of her own grief. She knew this was a gamble, a step into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, like a seedling pushing through frozen earth, promising life even in the heart of winter. Winter tightened its grip on the Mississippi land, painting the fields in shades of muted grey and stark white. Yet, within the small farmhouse, a different kind of warmth began to bloom, slowly, cautiously, like a flower unfurling after a long, cold night. Daniel Cole, the quiet stranger who had arrived with the storm, had seamlessly woven himself into the fabric of Eleanor and Lily's lives. His promise to earn his keep had been an understatement. He proved himself indispensable, his competence a quiet revelation. The leaning fence by the north pasture, a constant source of worry for Eleanor, was expertly mended, its posts now standing sentinel against the biting wind. The chickens, often neglected in Eleanor's exhaustion, clucked contentedly under his steady hand, their eggs a surprising bounty. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his limp a silent testament to a hidden past, but never an impediment to his work. Lily, initially wary, had been the first to succumb to his gentle charm. Her initial shyness, a protective shell she'd formed since her father's death, began to crack. Daniel had a way with her, a quiet understanding that bypassed words. He'd sit by the fire in the evenings, after the day's work was done, and his large, calloused hands, so adept at mending fences, would delicately whittle small figures from scraps of wood. A bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. A tiny, sturdy horse. Lily would watch him, mesmerised, her small face alight with a wonder Eleanor hadn't seen in years. "Mr. Daniel, can you make a bird?" she'd ask, her voice a hopeful whisper. And Daniel, with a soft smile, would always oblige, the rhythmic sound of his whittling knife, a soft scrape and whisper of wood, became a comforting counterpoint to the crackling fire, a sound that spoke of creation and quiet industry. Eleanor watched him, her initial apprehension slowly dissolving like mist in the morning sun. She saw the kindness in his eyes when he looked at Lily, a genuine affection that warmed something deep within her. She observed his unwavering respect, his polite distance, his refusal to overstep boundaries. He never pried, never questioned, yet his presence was a constant unspoken offer of support. His presence was a quiet melody in the house, a counterpoint to her usual solitude. She found herself waiting for his return from the fields, for the low murmur of his voice. The house, once echoing with only her own thoughts and Lily's small sounds, now felt fuller, safer. One frigid afternoon, while mending a broken hinge on the barn door, Daniel paused, his breath pluming in the cold air. Eleanor, bundled in her heaviest coat, was helping him, her fingers clumsy with the tools. "It's funny," he mused, his gaze distant, "how sometimes the quiet is the loudest thing of all." Eleanor straightened, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He looked at her then, his eyes, the colour of deep river stone, holding a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. The quiet after the shelling stopped, or the quiet in a hospital tent. It screams, but here the quiet sings. He didn't elaborate, but Eleanor understood. He spoke of the echoes of war, of a soul that's born of trauma, and she, in turn, felt a profound connection to his unspoken pain. For her own silence had been born of loss, of the sudden, devastating quiet after Thomas was gone. They began to share stories, slowly, hesitantly at first, like two strangers cautiously testing the waters of a new friendship. Eleanor spoke of Thomas, her voice soft with lingering grief, of his dreams for the farm, dreams that had become her solitary burden. She spoke of the relentless struggle to keep it alive, the exhaustion that sometimes threatened to swallow her whole. Daniel in turn spoke of the war, not in graphic detail, but in hushed tones of camaraderie and loss, the places he'd seen, the faces he'd known. He spoke of the longing for a place to call his own, a sense of belonging that had been elusive since his return. He admitted to the quiet ache in his leg, a souvenir from a forgotten skirmish, a constant reminder of a past he couldn't outrun. He didn't explicitly say he had nowhere to go, but his words painted a picture of a man adrift seeking an anchor. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, they found themselves by the old willow tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the property. Its stark silhouette, its branches like weeping arms, seemed to mirror the quiet sorrow that had permeated Eleanor's life. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last vestiges of light fade, the air crisp and cold against their cheeks. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Daniel murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. Eleanor nodded, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time in months, the beauty didn't feel like a cruel mockery of her pain. It felt shared, a fragile thread woven between them, slowly strengthening with each passing day. The comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, still lingering on her clothes from the morning's baking, seemed to fill the cold air, a domestic warmth that settled around them. As the first star pricked through the twilight, Eleanor felt a subtle shift within her, a quiet unfolding. The willow, once a symbol of her grief, now seemed to stand as a testament to endurance, to the quiet strength found in unexpected company. And as she looked at Daniel, his profile silhouetted against the dying light, she realized that the subtle yearning she felt was not just for the past, but for a future, one that perhaps he might be a part of. Spring arrived in Mississippi with a burst of defiant green, painting the fields in emerald and unfurling the first delicate blossoms on the trees. The world outside the Hart Farm was awakening, but within its small insular community, a different kind of stirring began, the low, insidious hum of gossip. Daniel's presence, once a quiet, almost invisible comfort confined to the isolation of the farm, was becoming more noticeable. He drove Eleanor into town for supplies, his reliable, if patched-up truck a familiar sight on the dirt roads. He helped her sell her small surplus of vegetables at the general store, his quiet demeanour a stark contrast to the usual boisterous farmers. And with each public appearance the whispers grew. Mrs. Henderson, with her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, was the chief orchestrator of this insidious symphony. Eleanor would catch her gaze at the general store, a knowing, disapproving look that would prickle her skin. The other women in town would fall silent as Eleanor passed, their conversations resuming in hushed tones, punctuated by glances towards her and, more pointedly, towards the tall, quiet man who now often stood by her side. The oppressive silence after a particularly harsh comment, or even just a shared judgmental glance, weighed on Eleanor like a physical burden. Eleanor felt the shift, the tightening of the social noose. She'd always been an outsider, a city girl who had married a farmer and never quite fit into the rigid social fabric of rural Mississippi. Her widowhood, once a source of pity, now seemed to have become a canvas for judgment. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the burgeoning life of the farm, on the quiet joy Daniel brought into Lily's world. The fresh spring blossoms, so vibrant and full of promise, seemed incongruous with the building tension, a cruel irony. Then came Martha. Eleanor's late husband's sister, Martha Thorne, was a woman who embodied the town's conservative values, a woman who believed in order, propriety, and the sanctity of family reputation above all else. Her unannounced visit one sun-drenched afternoon in late spring felt less like a social call and more like an inquisition. Martha swept into the farmhouse, her starched dress rustling, her eyes missing nothing. She took in Daniel, who had just come in from mending a fence, his shirt dusted with earth, a quiet presence in the small living room. Her gaze lingered on him, cold and assessing, before turning back to Eleanor, her smile thin and unconvincing. "Eleanor, dear," Martha began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We've been hearing things in town." She paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. "About your living arrangements. And with Lily here, well, it's for her good, isn't it? What will people say?" Her questions were veiled threats, each word a subtle jab at Eleanor's perceived impropriety. Eleanor felt a slow burn of anger rise within her. "My daughter is safe with me, Martha, and Daniel is a good man. He's been a great help with the farm." Martha's smile tightened further. "Help is one thing, Eleanor, but a man living under a widow's roof? It sets tongues wagging, and wagging tongues can hurt Lily." Her gaze flickered to Lily, who was quietly playing with one of Daniel's whittled birds on the floor, seemingly oblivious to the tension, yet Eleanor knew Lily absorbed everything. Daniel, who had been standing silently by the door, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor, shifted. He didn't speak, but his gaze, usually so soft, now held a glint of steel. After Martha finally departed, leaving behind a lingering scent of lavender and judgment, Eleanor felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The righteous indignation that had fueled her defiance against Martha now drained away, leaving her hollowed out. The whispers, the stares, Martha's veiled threats, it was all a suffocating weight. She sank onto a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands, the quiet tears a testament to her profound weariness. Daniel found her there moments later, the clatter of a dropped plate from her earlier agitation having drawn him from the barn. He didn't say anything, just stood by the doorway for a moment, his presence a silent question. Then he moved to her, his movements gentle, unhurried. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, he simply knelt beside her, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry it all alone," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting balm. His touch, so unexpected, so tender, was a revelation. It wasn't the fleeting, accidental brush of hands as they worked, but a deliberate, comforting connection. Eleanor slowly lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the quiet, wounded veteran, but a man of immense strength and unexpected tenderness. In that moment, a profound understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried, and the quiet defiance that was beginning to bind them together. The blossoming affection between them, once a fragile bud, was now pushing through the soil, resilient and determined, despite the chilling winds of small-town judgment. The spring, with its promise of new life, was also bringing with it a reckoning. Summer descended upon Mississippi with a vengeance, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on the land and on Eleanor's heart. The whispers, once confined to the general store and Martha's veiled threats, had escalated into a full-blown storm. The humid air seemed to carry the weight of judgment, stifling and suffocating. The ultimate blow landed on Eleanor's doorstep one sweltering afternoon. A formal summons to the county courthouse. Her late husband's family, spearheaded by Martha and her brother, had filed a petition for custody of Lily. The grounds were laid out in stark legalistic language. Eleanor's immoral conduct and unstable environment, due to the presence of Daniel Cole, a man of unknown origins and questionable character. The paper trembled in Eleanor's hand, its cold officialdom a stark contrast to the furious heat that flared within her. Her initial reaction was a fierce, protective rage. How dare they question her love for Lily, her ability to provide a home? But beneath the anger, a cold, insidious fear began to coil. They had power, connections, and the weight of small-town morality on their side. The day of the hearing was a blur of oppressive heat and suffocating anxiety. The courthouse was a grand, imposing structure, its columns a stark reminder of the law's unyielding nature. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken judgment, a palpable tension that made it hard to breathe. The stifling heat of the courtroom seemed to magnify every nervous tremor. Eleanor sat beside a nervous elderly lawyer, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her in-laws sat opposite, Martha's face a mask of righteous indignation, her brother, a stern-faced vet, beside her. Lily, thankfully, was with a trusted neighbour, spared the ugliness of the proceedings. The accusations began, a parade of veiled slights and outright slanders. Martha testified, her voice clear and cutting, painting a picture of Eleanor as a neglectful mother, too caught up in an illicit affair to care for her child. The shame washed over Eleanor in waves, scalding her cheeks, making her want to shrink into nothing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her private grief and unexpected solace twisted into something sordid and wrong. The rustle of papers as legal documents were presented seemed to mock her, each page another indictment. Then Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, a silent, watchful presence, stood. Eleanor hadn't even known if he would come, knowing the scrutiny it would bring him. But there he was, a steadfast anchor in a sea of hostility. "Your Honour," he said, his voice, usually so soft, resonating with an unexpected strength that cut through the stuffy courtroom air. "May I speak?" The judge, a weathered man with tired eyes, nodded, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. Daniel moved forward, his limp more pronounced under the strain, but his gaze unwavering. He stood tall before the judge, facing the accusing stares of Martha and her brother, and the curious, judgmental eyes of the townsfolk who had come to watch the spectacle. "Eleanor Hart is a good woman," he stated, his voice clear, unyielding. "And this child is loved, more than anything. She works that farm day and night to keep a roof over Lily's head. She's faced more hardship than most folks could imagine, and she's done it with grace and courage." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Eleanor's tear-filled eyes. "I am a veteran. I fought for this country, and I came here looking for nothing but a quiet place to heal. Eleanor Hart, she gave me that. She took in a stranger, gave him shelter, gave him work. She didn't ask questions. She just saw a man in need." His voice deepened, a raw emotion entering it. "To say she's immoral, to say she's unfit, it's a lie. She's the strongest woman I've ever met. And if loving someone who helps her, who respects her, who cares for her child is immoral, then I don't know what decency is." Eleanor listened, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. Shame receded, placed by a fierce wave of love and gratitude. He was standing up for her, for them, risking everything in a town that would judge him even more harshly for it. His words were a balm to her battered soul, a shield against the public shaming. In that moment, a profound realization bloomed within her. This quiet, wounded man, who had walked into her life with the rain, had become more than just a helper, more than just a friend. He was her solace, her strength, her quiet defiance. The fear that had gripped her for so long began to recede, replaced by a fierce, undeniable truth. When it was her turn to speak again, her voice, though trembling, was clear, fueled by a newfound conviction. "He is my family and my daughter's," she declared, her gaze fixed on the judge, then sweeping to Martha and finally settling on Daniel. "Daniel has brought light back into our lives. He has helped me keep this farm, helped me raise my child, and if loving him, if building a future with him means facing your judgment, then so be it. I will not deny my heart, nor the love that has given us both hope." The words hung in the air, a public declaration, a defiant stand against the conservative tide of the town. Eleanor knew it would only intensify the scrutiny, that the fight was far from over. But as she looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with a raw reciprocal love, she felt an unwavering certainty. This was not just about Lily, it was about reclaiming her own life, her own choices, her own heart. The tremors in her hands were no longer from fear, but from the trembling intensity of a love that was finally defiantly out in the open. The immediate aftermath of the court hearing was a fractured sense of palpable tension that hung heavy over the small Mississippi town. The judgment for Lily's custody was pending, leaving Eleanor and Daniel in a state of suspended animation, a constant hum of anxiety beneath their skin. Yet in that uncertainty something else stirred. A quiet, unwavering resolve. The community, once a monolithic wall of conservative judgment, showed cracks. Some, particularly the women who had endured their own hardships and quiet rebellions, offered Eleanor small encouraging nods at the general store, a hushed, "Bless your heart, Eleanor," that carried more weight than any public declaration of support. The older men, their faces etched with the wisdom of the land, would offer Daniel a respectful tip of their hats, a silent acknowledgement of his courage in the courtroom. It was a divided reaction, but the pockets of empathy, once invisible, now shimmered with a quiet hope. Regardless of the legal outcome, Eleanor and Daniel made a decision that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. They would build a life together, on their own terms. The farm, once Eleanor's solitary burden, transformed into a shared dream. They spent the late summer and early autumn days planning, talking for hours under the shade of the old willow tree. Its branches, once weeping with Eleanor's grief, now seemed to whisper promises of resilience and growth swaying gently in the breeze. "We could plant more corn next year," Daniel suggested one evening, sketching lines in the dirt with a stick. "And maybe a small patch of cotton for extra income. I know a few buyers down in Meridian." His voice was full of a quiet enthusiasm Eleanor hadn't heard from him before, a practical optimism that grounded her swirling anxieties. Eleanor listened, her heart swelling. He wasn't just talking about crops, he was talking about a future, their future. "And the barn needs new roofing before winter," she added, already seeing the possibilities, the shared burdens, the collective strength. Lily, oblivious to the legal battles raging around them, was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. Her innocent joy, her bright laughter as she chased butterflies through the fields, was a pure, unadulterated source of hope. Daniel, now Papa Daniel to her, would lift her onto his shoulders, his limp forgotten in his eagerness to make her laugh. The rhythmic sounds of the farm animals, the clucking of chickens, the lowing of cows, the occasional bleat of a lamb, were no longer just the cacophony of her solitary struggle, but a comforting backdrop to their burgeoning family life. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the willow tree began to turn a brilliant gold, Eleanor and Daniel sat beneath its sprawling branches, watching Lily play in a patch of sunlight. She was meticulously arranging small wildflowers into a makeshift bouquet, humming to herself. The warmth of the late summer sun bathed them, a golden promise. Daniel reached for Eleanor's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was no longer tentative but firm, possessive, yet infinitely tender. "No matter what happens, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, his gun fixed on her, "we face it together." A profound sense of peace settled over Eleanor, a feeling she hadn't known was possible after so much loss. She squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "Always," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The word, a simple declaration, felt weighty with the promises of their shared past, their uncertain present, and their hopeful future. Lily, catching sight of a vibrant monarch butterfly fluttering past, gasped with delight. "Look, Mama, Papa Daniel, a butterfly!" she exclaimed, pointing a tiny finger. They watched it together, a fleeting moment of beauty and serenity. The butterfly, a symbol of transformation and new beginnings, danced through the air, free and unburdened. As they sat there hand in hand, the old willow tree swaying gently above them, its branches now a symbol of their enduring strength, Eleanor knew they had already won. The custody battle might be decided by a judge, but their love, forged in the quiet resilience of their hearts, had already found its resolution. They had found not just a love to shelter them from the storm, but a promise of home in each other's arms, their hearts finally at peace. Their future, like the endless sky above them, was open, waiting to be written by their own hands, their own unwavering love. When the stars fell. The air in the Australian outback carried the ancient scent of red earth and the faint medicinal whisper of distant eucalyptus. Caramel of profound and patient solitude, the kind Carmen had come to crave. Tonight, it was just her and the universe, the best kind of company. She moved with the practiced ease of a musician tuning her instrument, her hands gliding over the cool metal body of the Meade telescope. Each click of a latch, each turn of a knob was a familiar comfort, a small anchor in the overwhelming vastness that was beginning to swallow the landscape. In her late 30s, Carmen possessed a quiet intensity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes, the colour of rich coffee, held a galaxy of their own, a mix of scholarly curiosity and a deep, well-guarded sorrow. She was an astronomy teacher, a woman who found more solace in the predictable celestial dance of gas and fire millions of light years away than in the chaotic, unpredictable orbits of human connection. The observatory, a modest, slightly worn dome hunkered low against the horizon, was her sanctuary. As the last vestiges of bruised purple and faded orange bled from the western sky, the first diamond... Chips of starlight appeared. A sigh of contentment escaped her lips. This was why she'd driven 6 hours from the nearest town, for this perfect, untainted darkness. It was the crunch of boots on the gravel path that broke the spell. Carmen tensed, her hand freezing on the telescope's focus wheel. She wasn't expecting anyone. This place was a well-kept secret among serious stargazers, not a tourist hotspot. A man emerged from the deepening shadows, his silhouette tall and broad-shouldered. He carried a camera bag slung over one shoulder and had the slightly disoriented look of someone who'd been on the road for a very long time. "Is this the right place for the meteor shower? Feels a bit desolate," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that seemed to carry a wry smile. Carmen's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He didn't seem like a threat, just another soul drawn to the night sky. "It's perfect," she replied, her tone even, betraying none of her initial apprehension. "The less light pollution, the better. Desolate is what you want." The man stepped closer, into the faint glow of her small set-up lantern. He looked to be in his early 40s, his face etched with the fine lines of someone who had spent a lot of time squinting into the sun. There was a tiredness in his blue eyes, but also a spark of genuine interest. "Damien," he said, extending a hand. "Carmen," she returned, her handshake firm but brief. "Damien, the travel blogger," he elaborated, as if anticipating the question. "Figured I'd trade the usual beach sunsets for something a little more cosmic. Came to see the Perseids put on a show." "They should," Carmen affirmed, turning her attention back to her telescope. "Peak activity is in a few hours. You're early." "Story of my life," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He set his bag down and began to unpack a tripod and camera with a quiet efficiency that mirrored her own. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the soft clicks of his equipment and the gentle hum of Carmen's telescope tracking the slow spin of the Earth. It was a silent ballet of two strangers, each preparing their own small station from which to witness the heavens. The quiet that settled between them wasn't awkward. It was... ooh. The immensity of the desert seemed to absorb any need for trivial chatter. Damien finally broke it. "You do this often?" "As often as I can," Carmen said, her gaze fixed on the eyepiece. She was calibrating, aligning her view with a bright guide star. "It's my job, in a way. I teach astronomy." "Ah, so you're the expert," he said with a soft chuckle. "And here I am, just a guy with a nice camera hoping to get lucky." "Sometimes that's the best way to see it," she admitted, pulling back from the telescope. "Without all the names and numbers, just looking up." She gestured to the sky, which was now a profound, bottomless black velvet, strewn with a breathtaking quantity of stars. The Milky Way was a thick, shimmering river of light, so clear it seemed almost close enough to touch. Damien let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Wow, you don't get that in Sydney." "No," Carmen agreed, "you don't." A distant, lonely howl drifted on the dry air, a dingo calling out to the infinite night. The sound amplified the sense of isolation, of being at the very edge of the world. But for the first time in a long time, Carmen didn't feel entirely alone. She looked over at Damien, who was now staring up at the sky, his face tilted towards the cosmos with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was a stranger, yes, a temporary disruption to her solitude. But as she watched him, she felt an unfamiliar flicker of something other than a desire to be left alone. It was curiosity, and in the vast, silent desert, under a sky preparing to fall, that felt like a seismic shift. The night deepened, wrapping the desert in a cool, silent embrace. The preliminaries were over. Damien had his camera set for long exposures, its shutter opening and closing with a soft, satisfying click, and Carmen's telescope was perfectly aligned, though she found herself ignoring it. The main event had begun. The first meteor was a sudden silver slash against the canvas of the Milky Way, so fast it was almost an illusion. "Whoa," Damien breathed, a sound of pure wonder. A second one followed, then a third streaking across the starfield like divine calligraphy. They had both abandoned their equipment, now sitting on separate blankets a few feet apart, necks craned, gazes fixed on the celestial display. The silence between them had transformed, softened by the shared spectacle. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the comfortable quiet of mutual reverence. Carmen had brought a thermos, and the scent of chamomile tea mingled with the dry desert air as she poured 2 steaming cups. She offered one to Damien, and their fingers brushed as he took it. A small, unexpected jolt, like static electricity. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than before. He took a sip, the warmth a welcome counterpoint to the cooling air. "It's funny," he began, his eyes still on the sky. "You travel to escape things, but some things, they just follow you, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and them." It was an unprompted confession, a small, vulnerable stone tossed into the quiet pool of their shared space. Carmen didn't press, but she recognized the sentiment. It resonated with a painful frequency deep within her. "I was supposed to be in Norway last winter," Damien continued, his voice wistful, "to see the northern lights with my fiancé. We didn't make it. The trip, or us." He took another sip of tea, the silence that followed heavy with unspoken history. Carmen watched a particularly bright meteor burn a brilliant green as it disintegrated in the atmosphere. She understood the need to attach memories to the sky. It was safer. The stars held your secrets without judgment. "The stars don't judge," she said, echoing her own thoughts aloud. "They don't ask for anything. They just are. Sometimes that's all you need." He He turned to look at her then, his face illuminated by the faint starlight. He saw it in her eyes. A quiet strength, yes, but also a sadness she carried like a well-worn map, its creases softened by time, but its roots still deeply etched. He felt an immediate, intuitive kinship. This wasn't the brittle sadness of a recent wound. It was the settled, heavy grief of something permanent. "You sound like you know that feeling," he said gently. Carmen gave a small, sad smile. She thought of Leo, of his infectious laugh and the way he'd trace constellations on her back. He had loved nights like this. "I used to come out here with my husband," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so long. "He was an astronomer too. He believed the universe was full of second chances." She paused, her gaze lost somewhere in the Andromeda galaxy. He never got his. The confession hung in the air between them, as raw and real as the ancient rocks surrounding them. Damien didn't offer platitudes or apologies. He just nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. He recognized the shape of her loss, a gaping hole that no amount of time or distance could ever truly fill. They fell silent again, but the space between them had shrunk. The initial distance of polite strangers had been bridged by the shared girders of past pain. His camera continued its methodical work, capturing the light of falling stars, but the real story was unfolding here, on the ground, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Another meteor blazed across the sky, and they both let out a soft "ooh" in unison, a sound of childlike delight that felt strangely hopeful in the wake of their sad revelations. Damien found himself thinking that he had travelled to the ends of the earth seeking solitude, a way to seal himself off from the possibility of another heartbreak. Yet here, in the most desolate place he could find, he felt a connection more profound than any he'd experienced in years. He looked at Carmen, at the way the starlight caught in her dark hair, and felt a quiet longing that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with her. As the hours wore on, the night grew colder. The initial warmth of the evening had bled away into the vast, refrigerated desert, leaving a distinct chill in the air. Carmen shivered, pulling her thin jacket tighter. "Here," Damien said, his voice a low murmur. Without ceremony, he picked up his blanket and draped it around both their shoulders, creating a small, shared tent of warmth. The move was practical, yet it felt deeply intimate. Suddenly, the space between them was gone entirely. She could feel the solidness of his shoulder against hers, smell the faint, clean scent of his shirt mixed with dust and travel. Under the shelter of the blanket, the conversation resumed, softer, more confessional. The spectacular theatre of the meteor shower gave them the courage to speak of things usually kept in shadow. "It was a car accident," Carmen said, her voice barely a whisper, the word she hadn't spoken to a stranger in years. "He was on his way to a conference. There was a storm. He was so excited about a new paper he was presenting on binary star systems. How two stars can be caught in each other's gravity, orbiting a common centre of mass for millions of years." Her throat tightened. "I hated the universe for a long time after that. Hated the stars. They felt like a betrayal." Damien listened, his own past unfurling in response to her honesty. "Mine was a quieter kind of crash," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A slow erosion. Her name was Chloe. She wanted a home, a garden, kids, a life. She wanted me to choose that life over this." He gestured vaguely at the open road, the world beyond the observatory. "I told myself I was a wanderer, that it was in my blood. But the truth is, I was a coward. The thought of staying in one place, of being that responsible for someone else's happiness, it terrified me. So I let her go. And I've been wandering ever since, trying to prove to myself that I made the right choice." They sat in the weight of their shared histories, two souls defined by loss. Carmen by a love stolen from her, Damien by a love he had let slip away. They found a strange mirrored solace in their parallel pains, the guilt, the regret, the suffocating loneliness that followed. A meteor of impossible brilliance tore across the entire sky, a long, fiery trail of incandescent blue and green that lit up the desert floor for a fleeting second. They both gasped, a single, sharp intake of breath. In that moment of shared awe, Carmen turned her head, and her cheek brushed against the rough fabric of Damien's jacket. He turned his head at the same instant. Their faces were inches apart. The air grew thick, charged with something new and potent. It wasn't just empathy anymore. It was a fragile, terrifying spark of attraction. His eyes, blue even in the starlight, searched hers, and in their depths she saw her own pain reflected, but also a quiet longing that resonated with a frequency she thought had died within her forever. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, and her breath hitched. "I stopped believing in chance encounters after everything," Carmen whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Damien's gaze was intense, holding her in hers. "Maybe some things aren't chance," he replied, his voice a low caress. "Maybe they're just written." He didn't lean in. He didn't move at all. He gave her the space to retreat, but she didn't. She stayed right there under the shelter of his blanket, their shared breath misting in the cold night air. The rhythm of their breathing began to sync, quiet cadence against the silent flashes of the dying meteor shower. In his eyes, which reflected the last of the falling stars, she saw a pain she recognized, and a hope she was terrified to feel herself. He understood. He didn't just listen, he understood. And for the first time since Leo's death, the vast, empty space inside her didn't feel quite so infinite. The magic of the night was finite. As the first faint blush of grey began to soften the hard black edge of the eastern horizon, a new reality began to assert itself. The stars, which had been their confidants in their canopy, started to fade, retreating like shy ghosts before the approaching Tsar. The cold, which had been a reason to draw closer, now just felt like cold. The unspoken question hung between them, heavier than the silence had ever been. What now? The bubble they had created under the falling stars was about to burst, exposed by the harsh, clarifying light of day. It was Damien, the man accustomed to departures, who made the first move. He shifted, the blanket falling from Carmen's shoulders, and the sudden loss of his warmth was sharp and immediate. "Well," he began, his voice trying for a casualness it couldn't quite find as he started to gather his camera gear. "It was a truly incredible night. Thank you for sharing it." Each word was a small polite stone, rebuilding the wall between them. A night. A beautiful, singular event now concluded. An anecdote for a future blog post. A memory. Carmen felt a panic rising in her chest, cold and sharp. The old Carmen, the one who had driven out here seeking solitude, would have nodded, offered a simple "you too," and watched him drive away, accepting the transient beauty of the moment. But she wasn't that Carmen anymore. Not after this night. The thought of the silence returning, of this fragile, profound connection dissolving with the morning mist, was unbearable. "Wait." The word was quiet, but it stopped him cold. He turned back to her, his hand frozen on his camera bag. "Is that all it was?" she asked, and was horrified to hear her own voice catch, thick with a vulnerability she hadn't shown anyone in years. "Just a night?" Her question stripped away his carefully constructed defences. He looked at her, truly looked at her in the growing pre-dawn light. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the desperate plea to not let this moment vanish. He saw his own reflection there, a man on the run, not from a place but from a feeling, the feeling of wanting to stay. His entire adult life had been a series of beautiful goodbyes. He was an expert at them. He could appreciate a moment for its fleeting perfection and then move on, unburdened. It was his survival mechanism. But as he stood there, the thought of just walking away, of getting in his car and driving back to his solitary road suddenly felt unbearable. It felt wrong. It felt like leaving a crucial part of himself behind here in the red dust of the outback. What if... Carmen's voice was stronger now, bolstered by a surge of desperate courage. What if this wasn't chance at all? She was echoing his own words from hours before, turning them from a poetic observation into a direct challenge. She was asking him to be more than a wanderer. She was asking him to believe his own words. The distant call of a kookaburra rattled through the awakening bush, a stark, real-world sound that signalled the end of their nocturnal trance. The ground felt hard and cold beneath her feet. Damien looked from Carmen's searching face to the vast, empty road stretching out from the observatory, the road that had always been his answer. For the first time it didn't look like freedom. It looked like an escape. The sun broke the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the ancient sleeping land. The light was no longer harsh or invasive. It was warm, gentle, and full of promise. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between them, turning them into a glittering temporary galaxy. Damien let go of his camera bag. He took a step back toward Carmen, closing the small distance he had created. He looked down at her, his expression stripped of all pretense, all the easy charm of the well-travelled blogger. What was left was something raw and wonderfully real. "No, Carmen," he said, his voice low and certain, answering the question that still hung in the air. It wasn't just tonight. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, a confirmation. It was a beginning, if you'll let it be. Relief washed over Carmen so powerfully her knees felt weak. A single tear she hadn't realised she was holding escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Yes, she breathed the word a prayer and a promise. Yes, please. He didn't crush her in a passionate embrace. It was something far more tender, more meaningful. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tear. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a decision being made, a path being chosen. The wanderer was choosing to stand still, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery pent-up passion, but one of quiet, profound recognition. It was soft and hesitant at first, a question, and then it deepened as she responded, a mutual affirmation. It tasted of chamomile tea, cool night air, and the faintest hint of salt from her tear. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one story and began another. When they parted, they simply stood there for a moment, foreheads resting against each other, breathing in the new day. The observatory loomed behind them, a monument to the night that had brought them together, but their focus was entirely on each other. "I have a shoot in the Daintree rainforest next week," Damien said, his voice a murmur against her skin. "After that, my schedule is flexible. I can change it. I can come back." "I have a class to teach on Monday," Carmen replied, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes, "about stellar nurseries, places where new stars are born." The symbolism was not lost on either of them. "My number is..." They exchanged numbers, their fingers brushing, the simple act feeling more significant than any contract. They made a plan, a real, concrete plan. He would call her Tuesday. He would drive back down in 2 weeks. They acknowledged the distance, the complications, the separate lives they had lived until 12 hours ago. But for the first time, those obstacles felt like bridges to be built, not walls to keep them apart. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows from the lonely acacia trees, a sense of peaceful resolution settled over them. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more precious, a real and deeply moving beginning. As the first rays of dawn touched the ancient land, they knew this wasn't just a night under the stars. It was the start of their own constellation, drawn not by chance but by the undeniable pull of two souls finally finding their way home. The vast open desert stretched before them, no longer a symbol of their isolation, but a shared and hopeful horizon. Feathers and ink. The air in Blackwood Cemetery always tasted of memory. It was a crisp, metallic flavour that clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a blend of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the cold, unyielding patience of stone. For 2 years this flavour had been the prelude to her ritual, the start of a pilgrimage she made every morning, rain or shine. She walked with a gentle but weary grace, her 53 years etched not in harsh lines but in the soft, shadowed hollows beneath her eyes. Her path was a familiar map of grief, winding past the stoic angels and sleeping lambs until she reached the simple granite slab that read, "Thomas Gable, beloved husband, the music is not over." Ilara never spoke to the headstone. The words felt hollow, stolen by the wind before they could land. Thomas wasn't in the cold ground, he was in the echo of a shared laugh, the phantom warmth of a hand on her back, the scent of sawdust that still clung to his old workshop. Her ritual was for her a way to anchor, the day before it drifted away. "It isn't the dead I speak to, Thomas," she thought, her fingers tracing the cool engraved letters. "It's the memory of us. The ink is for me, the words are for what remains." From the deep pocket of her wool coat she pulled a folded sheet of thick cream-coloured paper. Using a fountain pen with a nib as fine as a feather, she had filled it with the quiet minutiae of her life, the leaky faucet she'd finally fixed, the surprising sweetness of the late-season tomatoes, the way the morning light still caught the dust motes dancing in the sunroom, just as he'd loved. It was a conversation with a ghost, a monologue of love that refused to fade into silence. But her pilgrimage had a second secret stop. Midway between Thomas's plot and a newer section of the cemetery stood a magnificent ancient oak. Its branches were gnarled, arthritic fingers reaching for the autumn sky, its trunk a fortress of grooved, moss-dusted bark. In its side, about heart-high, was a hollow, a smooth dark wound in the wood that had become her postbox. With a reverence that felt almost sacred, she slipped the letter inside. The hollow smelled of history, of rich soil and something wild. For 2 years it had been the silent keeper of her sorrow, but not today. This morning, as she reached into the familiar darkness, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Not just the smooth, cool wood, but paper. It was foreign to her touch, thinner than her own luxurious stationery, crisp and dry, folded into a sharp, neat rectangle. Her heart gave a painful, startled lurch. A trespass, an intrusion. She snatched her hand back as if burned, then, overcome by a sudden fierce curiosity, she reached back in and pulled the note out. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was not her elegant looping script. It was a man's hand, bold and angular, written in a simple black ballpoint pen. The words were few, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. "I thought I was the only one who spoke to the trees. For what it's worth, I hear you, and I understand." Ilara stood frozen, the note rattling in her hand. The world, which had been muted and predictable for so long, suddenly crackled with a terrifying, vibrant static. The crunch of leaves under a distant walker's feet, the caw of a crow from a bare branch, the scent of the coming frost, it all rushed in, sharp and overwhelming. Her solitary ritual, the quiet cornerstone of her life, had been breached. She looked from the note to the oak, then across the way to the newer graves. Someone was watching, someone was listening, someone understood, and she couldn't decide if it felt like a violation or a miracle. She folded the note carefully, its sharp creases a stark contrast to her own soft-edged letters, and slipped it into her pocket. As she walked away, she did not look back. The air still tasted of memory, but now it held a new, unfamiliar flavour, the electric tang of a question mark. For the first time in 2 years, as she left the gates of Blackwood Cemetery, Elara felt something other than the quiet ache of absence. She felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear, mingled with a whisper of something she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. Hope. The first frost arrived the following week, a delicate lacework of silver that glittered on the headstones and turned each blade of grass into a shard of glass. The world had grown colder, starker, and yet a strange, hesitant warmth had begun to bloom within Elara. It lived in her coat pocket, in the crisp, folded note she reread a dozen times a day. She wrote her next letter to Thomas with a different kind of energy. The words were still for him, but they were shadowed by a new awareness, a sense of an unseen audience. After she had tucked it into the oak's hollow, she found herself lingering, her gaze drifting across the cemetery. She saw no one. The secret was safe. 3 days later, a reply was waiting. Thus began their anonymous chorus. They were careful never to cross paths, their visits to the oak tree timed like the changing of a silent, unseen guard. He would leave a note, and days later she would find it. She would reply, and the space in the tree would remain empty until, one day, it wasn't. His name was Liam. He revealed it in his third letter, a simple signature at the bottom of a page torn from a practical spiral-bound notepad. He wrote that he visited his younger sister, gone too soon. He didn't offer details, and Elara didn't ask. In return, she shared Thomas's name. They were two shores of the same quiet sea of loss, their correspondence a message in a bottle tossed between them. Their early letters were philosophical, tentative explorations of a shared landscape. They wrote of memory, of how it could be both a comforting quilt and a crushing weight. "I think grief is like a phantom limb," Liam wrote, his blocky letters marching across the page. "You know it's gone. The doctors have told you it's gone, but you can still feel it ache when the weather changes. Today, the weather is changing." Elara found herself anticipating his words, the simple, unadorned honesty of them. He wrote like a man who built things steady and direct, while her own prose was more like a garden, full of winding paths and hidden blooms. "My husband used to say that hope was a stubborn weed," she wrote back on her thick cream paper. "You could try to stamp it out, but it would always find a crack in the pavement to grow through. For a long time my world has felt like solid, unbroken concrete. Your letters, I think, are becoming a crack in the pavement." Slowly the intimacy deepened. The anonymity became a cloak of courage, allowing them to confess the small secret shames of grieving. He admitted to feeling a flash of anger when he saw fathers walking their daughters down the aisle. She confessed that just last week she had laughed, a deep, rolling laugh at a silly joke on the radio, and the sound had been so foreign that it had immediately dissolved into tears of guilt. "My sister loved the rain," Liam's next letter read. "She said it was the sky's way of washing the world clean. She'd stand outside in it, arms wide open, and just let it soak her. Some days, I stand here and wish it would wash me clean too." Elara read his words while a cold November rain streaked down her kitchen window. She could almost see it, a young girl, vibrant and alive, welcoming the storm, and a man years later standing in the same rain, wishing for an impossible absolution. A magnetic tension was building between them, a pull born not of glances or touches, but of souls laid bare on paper. With every letter, the space between their two plots in the cemetery seemed to shrink, the ancient oak no longer a divider, but a bridge. She didn't know the sound of his voice or the colour of his eyes, yet she knew the precise cadence of his sorrow. She was beginning to realise that you could fall in love not with a person but with their words, with the shape of their heart on a page. The fear she had first felt was dissolving, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning trust. The question mark was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the cemetery in a thick, sound-muffling blanket of snow. The world grew quiet, forcing its inhabitants inward. The correspondence in the oak tree too turned inward. It was Liam who made the first move into truly personal territory, his questions simple yet profound. Tell me about a perfect day with him. The request sent a tremor through Alara. A perfect day? There had been so many. How could she choose just one to offer this kind stranger? She decided on a memory from long ago, before the lines of care had settled around her eyes, before Thomas's hair had been shot through with silver. A memory that also included her sister. She wrote for hours, the ink from her feathered pen flowing like a river breaking through a dam. She described a sweltering July day 30 years ago, when she, Thomas, and her younger sister Clara had piled into their beat-up convertible for a trip to the coast. She wrote of the wind whipping through their hair, of Clara's infectious, bubbling laugh as she sang off-key to Fleetwood Mac on the radio. She described the taste of cheap roadside ice cream dripping down their hands in the heat, and the gritty feeling of sand between their toes. We felt infinite, she wrote, her heart aching with the sweet, sharp pain of the memory. Lying on that beach, with the sun on our skin and the whole of our lives stretching out before us, we were immortal. Clara found a jay feather, a brilliant sash of blue, and tucked it into her hair like a crown. She looked like a wild queen. She painted the day in vivid, sun-drenched colour, deliberately omitting the darkness that had fallen on the ride home. She folded the letter, a thick, multi-page confession of a perfect stolen moment, and left it in the snow-dusted hollow of the oak. Liam's reply was delayed. For a week, the hollow remained empty. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Alara's mind raced. Had she shared too much? Had her portrait of happiness been too painful a reminder of his own loss? When his letter finally appeared, it was a single sheet, the handwriting tight, almost constricted. The tone had shifted from gentle camaraderie to something haunted. Your letter was beautiful, Alara. It sounds like a day I would have wanted for my own sister. She was so full of life like that, always chasing the sun. He then wrote about her, about how she died too young, on her way home from a trip with her best friend. Alara's breath caught. A cold dread, slow and creeping, began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness. It was 30 years ago, he wrote, on a back road not far from the coast. Route 7, a patch of gravel on a sharp curve. They never stood a chance. Route 7. Alara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The room began to swim. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a cruel, impossible coincidence. She read on, her eyes scanning the words with a frantic, horrified intensity. I was a volunteer firefighter then, just a kid really. We were the first ones on the scene. I pulled a girl from the passenger seat before it was too late for anyone else. I never knew her name. I just remember the feather she had tucked in her hair. It was blue. The pen dropped from Alara's numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. The deafening silence of the snow-covered world outside rushed in, filled with the ghost of a scream she hadn't let out in 30 years. The jay-blue feather. Her feather. Clara's best friend, Liam's sister. He didn't just understand her grief. He had been there at its birth. He had held it in his hands. The letter lay on the polished surface of her writing desk, an ordinary object that had detonated her world. Elara stared at it, the neat, angular script now looking like jagged shards of glass. Liam. The man whose words had become a lifeline, whose quiet empathy had coaxed a stubborn weed of hope to grow in the barren soil of her heart. He was the boy from her nightmare. Her study, usually a sanctuary of warmth and quiet contemplation, felt like a cage. The frantic, unsteady rhythm of her own heartbeat was a drum against her ribs. She stood up and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Outside, the snow-covered cemetery was a landscape of peaceful, monochromatic white. A perfect, beautiful lie. Beneath that pristine surface lay a history of violence and sorrow. A truth that now connected her to Liam in the most intimate and horrific way imaginable. He saved me. The thought was a physical shock, a jolt of lightning that lit up the darkest corners of her memory. She could suddenly feel the terrifying scrape of metal, smell the acrid smoke, taste the blood in her mouth. And through the haze of pain and confusion, she could see a face, young, terrified but determined, a boy leaning into the wreckage, his hands reaching for her. "I've got you," he'd said, his voice cracking with adrenaline and fear. "Just hold on, he saved me, and for 30 years I've carried the ghost of the girl he couldn't. His sister, Clara's best friend Sarah. Her mind was a storm. How could it be? How could fate be so cruel and so kind in the same breath? The man who was a comfort for her grief was inextricably linked to its very source. The stranger who had pulled her from the brink of death was the brother of the girl whose loss had shadowed her entire adult life. A wave of nausea washed over her. Guilt. It was a familiar poison, but now it had a new, unbearable potency. She had lived. She had loved Thomas. She had known decades of quiet joys and gentle sorrows, while Sarah's life had been extinguished in an instant. And Liam had spent those same decades mourning his sister, haunted by the memory of an anonymous girl, with a feather in her hair. This beautiful, fragile connection they had built. This sacred space in the hollow of an oak tree. Was it all built on a foundation of tragedy? A secret she had kept from the world, and now from him? He looked up out of the letter. She could retreat. She could stop writing, disappear back into the silence, and leave him to wonder. She could preserve the purity of what they had shared, this anonymous chorus of two wounded souls. It would be easier, safer. But his words echoed in her mind. "I hear you. And I understand." He had understood more than he ever knew. He had been listening for 30 years. To run now would be the ultimate betrayal, not just of him, but of the girl she had been, the survivor he had pulled from the wreckage. He deserved the truth. He deserved to know that the life he saved had been a life worth living. It was a debt she had not even known she owed. With a trembling hand, Elara picked up her feathered pen. The ink felt impossibly heavy. She took a fresh sheet of her cream-coloured paper, but her usual flowing prose abandoned her. There were no paragraphs, no poetic metaphors left. There was only the stark, terrifying truth. She wrote only 10 words, her handwriting shaky and unfamiliar. "I know that road. I was in the car. Please, meet me at the oak tree. Sunrise." She folded the note, her movements stiff and robotic. The finality of the ink on the page felt like a verdict. She had no idea what would happen when he read it, what dawn would bring. She only knew that their anonymous chorus was over. The silence was about to be broken, and she was terrified of what she would hear in the echo. Dawn broke reluctantly, spilling soft watercolour hues of rose and pale gold across the snow-covered landscape. The air was achingly cold, so still that Elara could hear the soft crunch of her own boots on the pristine snow. Her breath plumed in front of her, a visible manifestation of the life churning inside her chest. She stood by the oak tree, her hand resting on its rough ancient bark, drawing strength from its silent endurance. She saw him approach from the far side of the cemetery, a solitary figure moving through the rows of sleeping stones, a silhouette against the burgeoning light. As he drew closer, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic wild bird beating against its cage. This was him, Liam, a man she knew intimately and not at all. He stopped a few feet away. He was tall, with a quiet intensity in his posture, his face weathered by time and sorrow, but his eyes were kind. They were the eyes of the boy who had reached for her in the darkness. A long heartbeat-like silence stretched between them, thick with 30 years of unspoken history. The air crackled with it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a flicker of recognition, of a memory buried deep beneath decades of grief, crossed his face. It wasn't a sudden dramatic realization, but a slow, dawning comprehension, like the sunrise itself. He didn't need to ask. His voice, when it came, was raspy, full of a fragile wonder. "The feather," he said, the two words holding the weight of a lifetime. Elara could only nod, a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. Tears she had held back for 30 years finally fell, hot against her frozen cheeks. They weren't just tears of sorrow, but of gratitude, of catharsis, of an impossible, painful beauty. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic retelling of that terrible day. They didn't need to. The trauma was a chasm between them, but they chose not to fall into it. Instead, they began to build a bridge across it, one quiet word at a time. He spoke of Sarah, her laugh, her terrible taste in music, her fierce loyalty. Elara spoke of Thomas, his steady presence, his gentle humour, the way he had patiently helped her piece her shattered life back together. And for the first time, Elara spoke of Clara without the crushing weight of guilt, sharing a memory of her sister that made Liam smile. They were giving faces to the names in their letters, transforming ghosts back into people, their shared grief finally finding a voice. "All these years," Liam said, his gaze lost somewhere in the pastel sky, "I mourned my sister, and I carried the memory of a girl I couldn't save. I never let myself think about the life I did save. I never let myself hope she was okay." "And all these years," Elara replied, her voice thick with tears, "I felt like a ghost, a survivor who didn't deserve to be. You were the first person who saw me, really saw me, both times." He looked at her then, and the chasm disappeared. In its place was a connection so profound, so forged in the crucible of fate, that it left them both breathless. He didn't just save her life, he had returned to it decades later to help her truly live it. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadow across the snow, Liam reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm, solid, real. After months of paper and ink, of words and whispers, the simple, profound connection of flesh and bone was a homecoming. Her hand, which had held a pen to write of loneliness, now rested in the hand that had pulled her from the darkness. They stood there for a long time, two solitary souls no longer alone, while the first bird song of the morning broke the sacred silence. In the quiet language of loss, they had found a grammar for hope, realizing that the deepest roots of love often grow in the very places we believe to be barren. The story of feathers and ink was over, but the story of Elara and Liam had just begun. The world had shrunk to the size of a window pane. Beyond the leaded glass, a thick white fog pressed in, erasing the line between the sea and the sky, swallowing the jagged peaks of the Kiraeng that were supposed to be the main attraction. For 10 days the Isle of Skye had been nothing but a ghost of itself, a place of muted sounds and blurred edges. It suited Alessa's mood perfectly. Her husband, Marco, had called it a convalescence. "The clean air will do you good, my love," he'd said, his voice laced with the practical concern that had defined their marriage. "The city smog suffocates you. Go, breathe." But the air here wasn't clean. It was heavy, saturated with salt and damp and the smell of wet earth. It filled Alessa's lungs with the same oppressive weight that had settled on her spirit. The illness had receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, a weariness that seeped into her bones. Worse, it had stolen her words. The poet in her had gone silent, leaving only a hollow ache where rhythm and metaphor used to live. She sat in a worn armchair, a tartan blanket over her knees, and watched her neighbour. His cottage was a near-identical twin to hers, a squat stone building hunkered down against the wind, no more than 50 feet away. He was a myth wrapped in shadow, an American, the innkeeper had told her, a photographer, Elias, a name as solid and spare as the man himself. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stillness, as if the very air he displaced was a burden. Most days he would sit on his own porch, methodically cleaning the lenses of his camera, the brass and steel components gleaming even in the diffuse light. Then he would sling the worn leather strap over his shoulder and walk directly into the fog, disappearing completely. Hours later, he'd return, his dark hair slicked with mist, his jacket soaked, his expression unreadable. He never seemed to carry anything back but the camera on his chest. He moves like a man who has seen the end of the world, Alessa thought, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold teacup, and is in no hurry to find the beginning of a new one. I think I understand. The silence between their cottages was a living thing, punctuated only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant rhythmic sigh of the waves against the cliffs. And sometimes another sound would cut through the quiet, the sharp metallic click of his camera's shutter. It was a sound of finality, of a moment captured and pinned down. She wondered what he found to photograph in the endless featureless grey. Was he too documenting the void? On the 11th day, a restless energy propelled her from her chair. She wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the small stone porch, leaving the cottage door ajar. The damp air was a shock, instantly chilling her skin. She breathed it in, a shallow, careful breath that ended in a familiar betrayal. A tickle, then a rasp, then a full-body rattling cough. It seized her, doubling her over the porch railing. Her lungs burned, tears pricking her eyes. She fought for breath, each gasp ragged and loud in the profound quiet. When the spasm finally subsided, she was left trembling, leaning against the cold stone, utterly spent. And then she saw him. He had emerged from the fog so silently he might have sprung from the earth itself. He stood a few feet away, a ghost in the mist, holding a simple glass of water. He offered it to her without a word, his expression obscured by the gloom, but his gesture was one of simple, unambiguous kindness. Alessa straightened up, embarrassed, and took the glass with a shaky hand. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. She drank, the cool water soothing the raw fire in her throat. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His face was all harsh lines and angles weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a deep, startling blue, even in this colourless world. They held a profound, ancient weariness. "The damp gets in your bones here," he said. His voice was a low gravel, rough with disuse. The American accent was unmistakable, flattened by years away from home. You learn to live with it, or it swallows you whole. She handed the empty glass back to him, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. His were cold, firm. "I am Alessa," she said, finding her voice. "My husband." He thought the air would help. She ended with a small, self-deprecating smile. "Elias," he replied. He didn't smile back. He just watched her, his gaze steady and intense, as if he were trying to find the right aperture to see her through. The fog swirled around them, a thick living curtain. For the first time since she'd arrived, Alessa didn't feel like it was isolating her. It felt like it was holding them together in a small shared pocket of the world. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken presence of another soul. He gave one last nod, then turned and dissolved back into the mist, leaving Alessa alone on the porch, the taste of clean water on her tongue and the echo of his voice in the air. The fog, as if by some unspoken agreement, began to recede. It didn't vanish entirely, but thinned into a gauzy veil, revealing a world of dramatic, sweeping beauty. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and moody greys, and the sea, now visible, churned with a restless energy. The landscape was stark and primal, and for the first time, Alessa felt a flicker of something other than melancholy. It was awe. Feeling her strength slowly returning, she began to take short, hesitant walks along the cliff path. She never strayed far, her lungs still a fragile barometer of her exertion. On the third day of this new routine, she saw Elias emerge from his cottage, his camera, as always, his silent companion. He watched her for a moment as she navigated the muddy track, her steps uncertain. "There's a place," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind, "sheltered just a little further." She paused, surprised by the invitation. "I don't want to intrude on your work." He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "The ghosts don't mind." He started walking, and after a moment's hesitation she followed. He led her away from the cliff's edge, inland toward a shallow, green valley, where the skeletal remains of a village stood against the sky. It was a crofter's settlement, abandoned for a century or more, the stone walls of the cottages crumbling, their roofs long since surrendered to the elements. The wind whispered through the empty doorways, a lonely, keening sound. As they walked among the ruins, the silence between them began to fill with words. It started small. He asked about Italy. She asked about America. But soon the conversation deepened, drawn out by the profound solitude of their surroundings. "I feel like these stones," Alessa confessed, running her hand over the rough lichen-spotted wall of a roofless cottage. "Solid on the outside, but hollow within. My words, they have gone. It is as if the illness washed them all away, and I am left with nothing but silence." Elias was quiet for a long time, framing a shot of a single defiant thistle growing from a crack in a hearthstone. The click of the shutter was the only reply. Then he lowered the camera. "Words can be a lie," he said, his gaze fixed on the flower. "They dress things up, make them prettier or uglier than they really are. Sometimes the silence is more honest." He spoke guardedly about his work, calling it reportage. He never used the word war, but he spoke of places where the silence was a scream, where the dust was made of memories people wanted to forget. He spoke of Vietnam. He showed her how he saw the world, urging her to look through the viewfinder. The world shrank, became focused, intense. He had framed a shot of a fallen wall, the way the afternoon light caught the vibrant green moss clinging to it. Through his lens, it wasn't decay, it was tenacity. It was life persisting against all odds. "You photograph what is," she said, her voice filled with a newfound understanding, the hard truth of it. She looked around at the empty homes, at the ghosts he'd mentioned. "I write about the feelings left behind, the echoes. Perhaps they are the same thing." He didn't answer, but a different kind of silence settled between them, one of shared comprehension. She began to tell him stories, inventing lives for the families who had once warmed their hands by these cold hearths. She gave them names, sorrows, and simple joys, weaving tales from the shapes of the stones. He listened, his expression softening, the harsh lines around his eyes easing. She was lost in a story about a fisherman's wife waiting for a boat that would never return when she felt it. The slight shift in his posture, the quiet intensity of his focus on her. The camera was up. She froze, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable, but he didn't lower it. He waited, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't stealing her image, he was asking for it. Slowly she relaxed, turning her face slightly toward the weak sunlight, letting him see what he wanted to see. Click. Later that evening, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Elias. In his hands was a photograph, the paper still curling slightly, the chemical scent of the dark room clinging to it. It was her. She took it, her heart thudding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a portrait, but not like any she had ever seen. He had captured her in the ruins, her hair tossed by the wind, her face pale, but there was no trace of sickness in her eyes. Instead, he had found a flicker of the fire she thought had been extinguished. He'd seen the storyteller, the survivor. He had seen a strength she had forgotten she possessed. It was the most intimate, most honest gesture anyone had ever offered her. I've spent years documenting destruction, Elias thought, as he walked back to his own dark cottage. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers where they'd brushed his. How do you photograph something being rebuilt? How do you photograph hope without it feeling like a lie? He looked back toward her cottage, where a single, warm light now burned against the encroaching twilight. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a brooding canvas of grey. The next, the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, battering the small cottage. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes in their frames. Alessa stood watching the sea, now a furious churning cauldron of white foam, when the lights flickered twice, then died, plunging the room into a deep, disorienting gloom. The cold crept in almost immediately. She was fumbling for matches to light the paraffin lamp when a sharp, insistent knock came at the door. It was Elias, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous grey of the storm, his jacket already plastered to his frame. "My fire is lit," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's warmer. Come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an offer of sanctuary. She grabbed her thickest shawl and followed him across the churning, muddy ground between their cottages. His cottage felt instantly different from her own. Where hers was tidy and impersonal, a rental space, his was intensely, chaotically his. Books were stacked on every surface, maps were pinned to the walls, and the air was thick with the rich, earthy scent of a peat fire that blazed in the hearth. And everywhere there were photographs, tacked to the walls spread across a large wooden table, clipped to a wire hanging across the room. They were stark black and white images of a world away from this misty island. A soldier's haunted eyes, a grieving mother's silent scream, a city street turned to rubble. It was a gallery of human suffering, captured with a devastating, unflinching honesty. The weight of his past was here, in this room, a silent, powerful testimony. The storm raged outside, sealing them in. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the frozen faces in the photographs seem to flicker with life. The air between them was electric, charged with all the things they hadn't said. Forced into this raw proximity, there was nowhere left to hide. Alessa's gaze landed on one particular photo, set apart from the others on the mantelpiece. It was smaller, quieter, but somehow more devastating than the rest. It wasn't of a person, but of a single, worn-out child's shoe, half buried in the mud of a flooded road. "Tell me about this one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, stripped of its usual defences. "Vietnam," he said. "A village near the delta. We were moving through after a sweep. There was nothing left, just mud and silence. I saw the shoe and thought, that's the story. That's all that's left. So I took the picture." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then I saw her, the little girl, hiding in a ditch. She had no shoes. She was just staring at me." He finally turned to look at Alessa, his blue eyes shimmering in the firelight, raw with a pain that time had not touched. "They give you medals for watching," he said, his voice cracking, "for being invisible. But you're never invisible. You carry every face with you. I took the picture, and then I walked away. I was a vulture, picking over the bones." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Alessa didn't offer him pity or empty platitudes. She offered him the only truth she had. "We all have our ghosts, Elias." She moved closer, her shoulder almost brushing his. "My husband, Marco, he's a good man. He loves the woman I was, the one who hosted dinner parties and laughed at all the right moments. But he's afraid of the woman I'm becoming, the one who is quiet, the one who is breaking. My great fear isn't dying. It's living a life that is only half lived, a beautiful, empty room." In that shared darkness, their separate pains found a common language. He saw her fear of fading away, and she saw his agony of having seen too much. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently, reverently, traced the line of her jaw. His touch was a question, a plea, a confession all at once. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. The raging storm outside was a distant echo of the tempest inside her. This was wrong, and yet it was the only thing that had felt right in months, perhaps years. It was inevitable. In the flickering firelight, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and deep, a collision of loneliness and longing. It tasted of salt and rain and peat smoke, a kiss born of storms both inside and out. It was the breaking of a long, painful silence, and in the shelter of his cottage, with the wind screaming outside, Alessa felt for the first time truly safe. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the island scrubbed clean, dripping and gleaming under a sky of impossible blue. The air was crystalline, and the sun, a rare and precious gift, poured down like liquid gold. It felt like the world had been remade, and in a way it had. The boundary they had crossed in the firelit darkness of Elias's cottage had changed everything. The tentative curiosity had been replaced by a current of intimacy that flowed between them, as tangible as the light breeze. An unspoken giddiness took hold, a feeling of joyful, reckless abandon. "We can't waste a day like this," Alessa said. Her face turned up to the sun, a genuine, radiant smile transforming her features. "It feels borrowed." "Then we should spend it well," Elias replied, the ghost of a smile touching his own lips. For one perfect sun-drenched day, they became tourists in their own temporary world. He drove them in his battered Land Rover, the windows down, the fresh, clean air whipping through the car. They were no longer the poet with no words and the photographer with no voice. They were just a man and a woman, alive and together under a brilliant sky. He took her to the fairy pools where the water ran with a magical turquoise clarity over a bed of smooth stones. They took off their shoes and waded into the icy stream, their laughter echoing in the glen. He showed her how to work his camera, how to frame the world, how to find the light. She was a natural, her poet's eye translating easily to the visual medium. She captured a shot of him, unawares, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before and felt a possessive thrill. Later, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, she pulled a pen and a paper napkin from her pocket. The words that had been locked away for so long came flooding back, not in a torrent, but in a slow, clear stream. She wrote a short, simple poem about light and water and the startling blue of a stranger's eyes. Without rereading it, she folded the napkin carefully and pressed it into his hand. "For your collection," she said softly. He tucked it into his shirt pocket over his heart without looking at it. The day felt stolen, a perfect incandescent bubble of time. They shared stories of their childhoods, hers in a bustling, sun-baked Naples apartment, his in the vast, empty plains of Nebraska. They created a history for themselves that consisted of only this single perfect day. As afternoon bled into evening, he drove them to Niced Point. They walked the long, steep path down to the lighthouse, a stark white tower standing sentinel at the very edge of the world. They sat on the grass, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. It was breathtakingly beautiful and achingly finite. Then, as the last sliver of sun vanished, the lighthouse came to life. A brilliant white beam sliced through the deepening twilight, sweeping across the sea, over the cliffs, and across their faces in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Light, then dark, light, then dark. The steady, predictable sweep of the beam was a reminder of the world outside their bubble, a world of order, of responsibility, of promises made long ago. It was Alessa who broke the spell. "I received a letter yesterday," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the waves below. "It was from Marco. He's coming at the end of the week, to take me home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. Home. The word felt foreign, a place she no longer recognized. Elias didn't speak. He just watched the relentless rhythmic light. Light, then dark. "It always comes back around," he said, his voice flat. "A perfect circle. You can count on it." The unspoken meaning was painfully clear. The lighthouse beam was a circle, a constant. Their time together was a straight line, and they were standing at the end of it. The joyful abandon of the day dissolved, leaving behind a profound and tender sorrow. This beautiful, borrowed sun was setting, and they both knew it would not rise for them again. The choice was never discussed. It didn't need to be. It had been made for them years ago in other countries, in other lives. This day was a gift, a perfect memory to be stored away. It was not and could never be a beginning. The end came on a quiet, grey morning. The weather had returned to its sombre sky temperament, the sky a blanket of soft pearlescent grey, the air still and cool. The tide was out, exposing a wide expanse of dark, slick rocks and seaweed, the sea a distant, placid line. It felt like the island itself was holding its breath. Alessa was packed. Her 2 small suitcases stood by the door of her cottage, a silent testament to her imminent departure. Marco had arrived the night before, a whirlwind of cheerful, oblivious energy. He was a handsome man, with an easy smile and a proprietor's air of confidence. He had kissed Alessa soundly, declared the island air had worked miracles, and spoken at length about a dinner party they were hosting upon their return to Italy. He was the physical embodiment of the life she had chosen, the life to which she was returning. He saw her rosy cheeks and renewed energy, and saw only a successful cure. He did not see the ghost in her eyes. Now he was loading the car, humming a jaunty tune, blissfully unaware of the profound, silent drama unfolding just a few feet away. Elias stood on his porch. He and Alessa hadn't spoken since Marco's arrival. There was nothing left to say. Now, as Marco disappeared into the cottage for a final check, Elias walked across the damp grass that separated them. He stopped a few feet from her. The silence between them was vast, filled with the weight of their single, perfect day and the stormy confessional night. There were no grand declarations, no pleas, no desperate promises. Theirs was a connection that had existed outside of language, and it would end the same way. It was a moment of profound, painful understanding. He held out his hand. In it was the photograph he had taken of her in the ruins. The black and white print was stark and beautiful. She looked strong, windswept, and alive. A woman she was only just beginning to know. "Something to remember the light," he said, his voice low and rough. Her hand trembled as she took it. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the small folded napkin. The ink of the poem was slightly smeared. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Something to remember the words." She pressed it into his hand. It was an exchange of the parts of themselves they had reawakened in each other. Her rediscovered strength, his broken silence. "Thank you," she said. The words a bare breath of sound. For the quiet and for the storm. He gave a single sharp nod, his blue eyes holding hers for a long final moment. In their depths she saw the ruins, the storm and the sun. She saw everything. Marco came back out, smiling. "All set, my love." He put a proprietary arm around her shoulder and guided her to the car. She did not look back. Alea stood motionless as they got in, as the engine started, as the car pulled away, its tyres crunching on the gravel drive. He didn't move until the car was a small speck disappearing down the winding road. Some stories you don't tell, he thought, his hand closing around the fragile paper in his pocket. You just live them, and that has to be enough. He slowly raised the camera that hung, as always, from his neck. He looked through the viewfinder, his vision blurring for a moment. He didn't aim it down the road where she had gone. He focused on the empty porch of her cottage, on the simple wooden chair where she had sat watching the fog. He focused on the empty space, a perfect composition of loss and memory. The shutter clicked, a final quiet punctuation mark at the end of their story. For the rest of their lives, on opposite sides of the world, neither would ever hear the cry of a gull or feel the sea mist on their face without remembering the choice they made. Not for a lifetime, but for a moment that was, in its own way, enough.